Man, I love how we're like 15 minutes into this session and we're just now starting to talk about coral food.
Yeah.
What's your general stance on, I guess, coral food, coral feeding, and nutrition?
Well, um, I get that corals have mouths,
Mm-hmm.
so they like to eat something. And I, I do think obviously because of that, it is beneficial to corals. But I I've tinkered with it.
Mm-hmm.
I've tried different products, and eventually it goes to the wayside like frozen food does, and I start to neglect doing it. And I really don't experience much of a benefit, maybe because I've never done it consistently. But what I do know is I'm able to grow the corals I want to grow
Mm-hmm.
without feeding a coral food to my tank. So um, it's not necessary for me to have a beautiful reef tank with healthy corals. It's not a necessary requirement for me to feed the tank coral food, at least in my experience. So, again, it's another nutrient source. Why would I bother with it? I mean, I've tried. I've had fun with it. I mean, especially like LPS are fun to feed, right? And
So
anemones
much
are
fun.
fun to feed. But then you get into like SPS, then you get into gorgonians and some of these smaller polyp stuff, and I go in there with my little pipette and try different particle-sized foods and all this stuff. I don't know. I don't really see much of a benefit. It's hard for me to calculate an increase in growth rate or coloration, perhaps, because I do run a somewhat nutrient-rich tank. I don't run like an ultra-low nutrient system, right? Even when I was into SPS, you would consider my tank fairly dirty compared to like how crazy people go with keeping their nutrients down. So maybe if your tank is just super starved of phosphates and nitrates, right? I do believe that, and I've read some articles that seem to support the idea that some of the coral feeding is really there to introduce the necessary nutrients for the zooxanthellae, right?
Yeah.
It's a mechanism for bringing in a phosphate or nitrogenous waste. And I say it like that because I'm at the moment, like I don't quite remember like if it's ammonia or like nitrates they're in that zooxanthellae prefer, but either way, again, going back to the real reef analogy, the water may be so poor in those elements that the only way to provide that for the zooxanthellae is by ingesting bacteria and small particles of food that have those building blocks, right? So I get that maybe in a very nutrient poor system, coral feeding could show huge benefits, right? So somebody might be listening to this and think I'm crazy, but I just have never really seen a need to do it.
So you don't deliberately feed your corals.
No.
And then I have my entire recipe with like every piece of food in the market that I feed, a few times a week at night. So those great points of view when it comes to feeding. I think we can both agree, though, that corals need the zooxanthellae within the corals needs the nutrients, however that's delivered, in order to photosynthesize, right? They're not every plant needs nitrogen and they need phosphorus. And this is a great time to point out that if a coral food says it's phosphate free, that's not food. You have to have phosphate in the food for it to be food and nutritious. But I guess kind of along those same lines, man, I don't think corals really care what you feed them as long as it's got the nutrients and as long as they can get it in their mouth, right? So I care a lot more about particle size than I do of like feeding one of everything.
Yeah, I mean with fish, you have obligate corallivores, you have things that were evolved to eat specific things. I think in the realm of corals, where everybody's like, "Oh, I wonder what its natural prey is." I'm like, I don't think it cares, right? I think it's similar to carnivorous plants, right? I mean, they evolved to grow in very nutrient-poor situations, and they have, like the Venus flytrap and pitcher plants, the whole reason is it's not like they're eating it and they have a stomach, and they're using it to get the building blocks that allow them to continue with photosynthesis, right?
They straight need the fertilizer.
The fertilizer. That's the word I'm looking for.
We're just on the cusp of making some big growth moves here at the Reef Builder Studio, and I really want to do some studies. Do one tank that's kind of nutrient poor, and then do one tank where I literally only add nitrate and small amounts of phosphates, and another tank where I actually feed to reach those same levels. And I suspect that just having the nitrate and phosphorus in your water will probably get you like 80% of the way in terms of just general coral growth, health, and vitality. I think the only caveat to all of this is just like fish feeding, right? If you're trying to condition fish to breed, okay, hit them with all the food that they need to make great sperm and eggs. Jamie Craggs has definitely demonstrated that feeding a lot is one of the biggest ways you can condition corals to create their egg and sperm bundles. They just can't. They don't have enough energy or building blocks purely from photosynthesis and what's in the water. And like you said, when you go diving and you see all the polyps open at night, when if it's a nighttime dive and you shine your light on different corals, man, every kind of coral will catch like bristleworms and just giant pods and even tiny little fish swimming in the water. They don't really care as long as they can digest it. And this is another point I want to bring up is corals have very simple digestive systems, right? So like I've seen people really packing like big old pellets into their LPS or Scolies. It's fun, it looks cool, but the homeboy doesn't have any way to chew that up. So that's one thing I do with some of the larger pelleted foods. There's been a lot more kind of really high-priced cold extruded foods for feeding anemones and for LPS. The first thing I do, man, is I take those and I just drop them in some like a little thing of water just to see if they'll dissolve, because if they don't dissolve, then that coral is just going to spit it back out. It'll suck some juice off the outside and just spit it back out. But that's why I feed a super wide range of coral foods. Then I really enjoy target feeding like Duncans and Elegants and Bubbles and anemones. But I have giant anemone pellets. I've stopped giving those to my anemones. I save those for my triggerfish, and I'd rather give the anemone like a bigger pinch of finer particles that I know are going to dissolve when it gets inside its gut.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, there's definitely and then the other thing is you were saying about the show me principle. I've always kind of judged reef tanks based on what I can see. Right, if I walk up to a tank, you can kind of tell if they feed a lot, or if their alkalinity is up, or if they're dosing amino acids, or if they have enough flow, if they have enough light. But man, you ain't never walked up on a tank and said, "Ooh, this tank looks like it has a lot of phytoplankton," let alone multiple types of phytoplankton. And if you're feeding non-photosynthetic gorgonians or sponges, or really want to get tricky with it, sure, go ahead and make your whole tank a nice green water soup once in a while. But we need more documentation and more evidence of certain foods actually having a general effect on the well-being of our corals.
Well, I would definitely love to see more experimentation, right? Does calcification, right? Like your alk consumption also in your tank change with feeding? I mean, you could do a lot of cool experiments. I just don't have the time to do that.
Basic experiments, right?
Yeah.
I know, I wouldn't call you a casual hobbyist, but this is where I'm over here creating the content. So we're going to come up with some ideas on how to do this stuff. But yeah, you really. The other thing is, when it comes to all these things you should be doing for your fish and your corals, right? High light, high flow, dose this, dose that. That should be the purview of the coral farmers or the coral breeders, who are doing research and stuff. Or, certain exhibits that right now are trying to rescue some Caribbean stony corals. But if you have a casual, laid-back reef tank, don't even worry about it, man. If you just want some pretty animals to look at, don't worry about it. These are kind of like the fringe things. It's no different from having, a very basic laptop that will just, open your email or whatever and do some web browsing versus, some dedicated, like, lot more RAM and a graphics card and a huge power supply and a high resolution screen. Unless you're trying to take your corals to the max, you shouldn't be worried about all these tiny little details that we know have a benefit, but they also have some side effects if you don't do it right.
I mean, you hit it on the head right there. Is if I was a coral farmer and I'm okay with some diminishing returns, right? I'm okay with pushing it to that edge of maximizing the things that I'm looking for in terms of growth and coloration. Then yeah, I get it. But I've not, with my casual observation, seen I've not experienced a failure to thrive in my corals or fish by keeping my feeding fairly simple and straightforward when it comes to fish, and also not really feeding my corals, right? I mean, they get fed. I mean, there's things in my tank that feed my corals, obviously.
Right.
But I've not seen a failure to thrive. So for me, tweaking out that little bit of extra by feeding the tank, coral food, I think there's more negatives to potentially doing that than the positives. And in my opinion, if you're going and looking at a bunch of Instagram home pretty tanks, I don't think you could tell the difference between who does coral feeding and who does not, except for if they're making feeding
this Reef
videos.
Tank powered by.
Right. I mean, I don't mean to discredit coral food or anybody that makes it. I just don't think it's a necessary element to have a good-looking reef tank. I don't
know if this necessary is the word I would use, but maybe like obligatory.
That's
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're definitely gonna have some more growth and a little bit more vitality, but do you really have to? No. We did this for a long time without it, and I don't think there's a nearly enough discussion or consideration of the role of fish poop as a source of coral food. Man, you go diving, you see all these little particles in the water. If there's fish that are evolved to eat the poop of other zooplanktivores, so first of all, fish poop is essentially like partially digested, bacteria-coated nuggets of nutrition. They're not like the manure that you think of, which is just fibrous and just junky. You're talking about, if a high metabolism anthias eats, some very highly nutritious zooplankton, it's not gonna just extract every bit of nutrition out of it just instantly. And that's why there's certain fish that are adapted to eating the poop, the fecal matter from zooplanktivorous fish, and that food rains on the reef tank all day long, and I'm wondering if that might be the missing link to certain non-photosynthetic stony corals or soft corals that we're into.